So I've been sitting with this stack of research you sent over for the last couple of days, and I have to be honest with you, I'm having a hard time shaking one specific image.
Mm,
It's not even the most violent part of the story necessarily, but it's the atmosphere.
right.
I was reading this account of the summer of 1647 inside the Topkapi Palace, and the source spends all this time describing the smell.
It's incredible, isn't it? That sensory detail is what makes history actually feel real. It pulls you right in.
Exactly. It's described as this warm night in Constantinople. You're deep inside the harem, which is already this forbidden place, and the air is just thick.
Uh,
It smells of rose water, which should be pleasant, but it's heavy. It's mixed with the smell of tallow from the oil lamps flickering on the walls. And underneath all of that, the smell of old stone. Stone that hasn't seen sunlight in centuries.
it creates a very specific kind of claustrophobia. You can almost feel the humidity and the weight of the walls just by reading it.
And in this oppressive, perfumed darkness, the sources introduce us to a woman named Isa. And this is rare, right?
Oh, incredibly rare.
Usually the women in these stories are anonymous, but here we have a name, Isa. She's 20 years old, she is Circassian by birth, but she hasn't seen her home since she was 12.
Right.
She was taken, sold in a market in Cairo, shipped across the Mediterranean, and for 8 years she has lived inside these walls. She has never stepped outside.
Which is the reality for every woman in that wing of the palace. Once you go in, the door's shut behind you.
That's it.
Your world becomes those courtyards. Your entire universe is those few acres.
So set the scene. Isa is asleep. It's the middle of the night. And then she feels hands shaking her. She wakes up, completely disoriented, and looks up to see a eunuch standing over her bed.
Mm.
And this is the part that got me. His face is blank,
Mm.
completely unreadable. He tells her to get up. He tells her to dress, but he doesn't tell her why.
And that silence is the first massive red flag. In the harem, life was incredibly regimented. Movements happened in daylight. They happened with ceremony, with protocol.
Right.
If you were being moved, there was paperwork, there was noise. A silent wake-up call in the middle of the night. That terrified everyone. That means it's off the books.
So Isa gets up, her heart pounding, and she follows him into the corridor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when she realizes she isn't alone.
Yeah.
The hallway is full of women, dozens of them. They're all moving in the same direction, barefoot on the cold tile. No one is speaking. It's this procession of absolute silence.
Just the sound of bare feet on stone.
And as she looks around, she starts to recognize faces. These aren't strangers.
No, these are her roommates, her rivals, her friends, the people she spent every waking moment with for 8 years.
She sees Layla, a 17-year-old Georgian girl.
Mm.
The notes mention that Layla played the ney flute so beautifully that the Sultan once stood up and applauded her during a performance.
Which was a huge honor. I mean, for the Sultan to single you out like that meant you were safe for a time.
She sees Fatma, who is 23. Fatma was high status. She had actually borne the Sultan a daughter.
Mm.
She had her own apartment. She sent a salary back to her family in Abkhazia. She had, made it.
She was at the top of the ladder, short of having a son.
And then she sees old Haddis, a woman who'd been there so long she served the previous Sultan. She was basically just washing linens now, a lifer.
So you have the full spectrum of the harem hierarchy there. You have the favorites, the artists, the mothers, and the laborers, all being herded together, no distinction.
All walking toward the courtyard.
Mm.
And when they get there, the eunuchs are waiting. They're standing in 2 rows, flanking a path that leads to the outer gate, the gate that opens onto the terrace overlooking the Bosphorus Strait.
A gate that, crucially, no woman ever walked through. Not unless she was being exiled or married off, and even then, never at night. That gate was the boundary of their world.
Isa steps between the rows of eunuchs, and then she sees it,
Mm.
the thing that stops her heart. Piled against the wall are canvas sacks, dozens of them. Beside the sacks, coils of rope. And beside the rope, stones.
River stones.
Specifically, the source says they were the size of a man's head, stacked in neat rows. Someone had spent hours arranging them.
That detail is chilling because it speaks to the premeditation. This wasn't a sudden brawl. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was logistics.
Yes.
Someone ordered the stones. Someone gathered them. Someone stacked them. This was a state-sanctioned operation.
And at the far end of the courtyard, past the sacks and the stones, stands the Kisler Aga, the chief black eunuch, the 3rd most powerful man in the empire.
Right.
He is holding a needle and thread. And the realization hits Isa, and it hits Layla and Fatma and everyone else in that courtyard simultaneously. They weren't woken for a transfer. They weren't woken for a ceremony.
They were woken to die.
The chief eunuch was there to personally sew the sacks. This is the story known as the Night of the Sacks. But, and I think this is where we really need to pivot for this deep dive, we can't just treat this as a ghost story, can we? No. It feels like if we just focus on the horror, we miss the point.
Absolutely. It's very easy to look at this event, and we are going to get into the gruesome details of how 280 women were drowned in a single night, and just say, well, that's just a crazy sultan. That's Ibrahim the Mad.
Right, it's easy.
It's easy to write it off as an anomaly of madness. But if we do that, we fail to understand what actually happened. This wasn't a glitch. This was the result of a machine.
A machine.
The Ottoman machine. The harem wasn't just a place for romance or debauchery. It was a system, a ruthless, highly efficient system built on kidnapping, forced sterilization, fratricide, killing your own brothers, and absolute unchecked power.
Wow.
We are going to talk about Sultan Ibrahim the Mad, yes. But to understand how he could order 280 women to be sewn into sacks, we have to understand the system that broke his mind before he ever sat on the throne.
So we're looking at the architecture of the horror. We're asking, how do you build a system where this is even possible?
Exactly. We need to look at the supply chain of human lives. We need to look at the cage that Ibrahim was locked in for 17 years. We need to understand the eunuchs who enforced the rules, because that night in 1647 wasn't the beginning of the horror. It was the end result of centuries of it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start at the very beginning of that supply chain, the people who filled that courtyard, the women. Where did they actually come from? Because popular culture gives us this Arabian Nights fantasy of the harem, lots of flowing silks and romance, but the reality was significantly different.
To put it mildly, yes, it was a supply chain. That is the only accurate way to describe it. These women, like Isa and Layla, were primarily from the Caucasus region, Circassians, Georgians, Abkhazians.
Why that region specifically? Was it just proximity?
It was partly proximity, but largely it was because they were prized for their appearance. In the Ottoman aesthetic of the time, Circassian women were considered the pinnacle of beauty. But the journey to get there, we have to be clear, these girls were gifts from provincial governors seeking favor, or they were purchased.
Purchased?
And purchased is a polite way of saying kidnapped.
Right, we're talking about slave raids.
Slave raids, yes. But also, and this is heartbreaking, economic desperation. In times of famine, parents in the Caucasus would sometimes sell their daughters to slave traders.
Oh, go.
The logic was, if she stays here, she starves. If she goes to Istanbul, she might end up in a palace. It was a gamble for her survival.
That is a horrific choice to make.
It is. So imagine you're 12 years old, you're put on a boat, you cross the Black Sea, which is a lethal journey in itself, notorious for storms and shipwrecks, and you arrive at Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. And then comes the first filter.
The sorting hat moment.
Effectively, yes. Upon arrival, these girls were inspected, often by the Veli Sultan herself, the queen mother, or the head doctor.
So it's a physical inspection.
It's a complete physical, medical, and aesthetic inspection. They're checking for health, for beauty, for any imperfections. And there was a split. If you were considered plain or if you had any physical imperfections, you became a laborer. You were a servant, cleaning, cooking, sleeping on mats on stone floors. You were part of the domestic staff. Still a slave, but with no chance of upward mobility.
But if you were beautiful, if you passed the test,
then you entered the track for power. You became a potential concubine. And this is where the biggest misconception lies. People think the harem was just a brothel. It wasn't.
Right.
It was an intense, high-stakes finishing school. Think of it like a mix between a strict boarding school and a military academy, but for charm.
A military academy for charm. That's a wild image. Break that down for me. What are they actually doing all day?
They are working harder than almost anyone else in the empire. Rigorous training. They learned the Turkish language. Remember, they arrived speaking Georgian or Circassian. They had to memorize the Quran. They learned belly dancing, yes, but also Persian poetry, literature, and music.
The notes mention the lute, the out, or the kanun. I want to pause on this because I think it's easy to gloss over. You said they learned the lute. We're not talking about strumming a few chords around a campfire, are we?
Not at all. This was conservatory-level training. Take the oud, for example. It's a fretless instrument. The precision required to play Ottoman classical music, which uses microtones, notes that don't even exist in Western music, is incredibly high.
Wow.
These girls were practicing for hours a day, for years. They had to be perfect. They were also learning calligraphy, how to serve coffee with perfect grace, how to walk, how to talk.
And they're doing this while, what? Just hoping to be picked.
It's worse than that. They are doing this under the gaze of the Kaya Kadin, the head stewardess. The source mentions she often carried a rod.
So discipline was physical.
It was immediate and physical, if you missed a note. Beatings. If you spilled a drop of coffee during the serving ceremony. Punishment. They were being drilled like soldiers, but the weapon was charm. They had to memorize the Quran, master Persian poetry so they could quote it in conversation. It was the total reconstruction of a human being.
So they were being engineered.
Rebuilt.
Yeah.
Their entire identity was reconstructed for one purpose, to please one specific man, the Sultan.
And the goal of all this training? The graduation prize.
The prize was to be noticed. It was called going to bed of the Gazda. If the Sultan noticed you, everything changed. You graduated from the dormitory. You got your own room. You got servants' girls who used to be your peers were now waiting on you. You got a salary paid directly from the imperial treasury.
A salary? That's fascinating. It creates this weird mix of slavery and professional employment.
It does. It's a bureaucracy. But the ultimate goal wasn't just money. It was survival. The goal was to bear a son. Because in the Ottoman system, a son was your insurance policy. If your son became the next sultan, you became the Valid Sultan. You ruled the harem. You ruled the empire. Effectively.
But here's the catch, right? And this is the engine of the whole tragedy. There can only be one sultan.
Exactly. And that arithmetic is what turns the harem into a shark tank. Only one son can succeed. The Ottoman laws of succession meant that all other sons usually died.
We'll get to that.
Therefore, every other mother in that harem is not just your roommate. She's not just your colleague. She is an existential threat to you and your child.
It puts a whole new spin on office politics.
It was legal competition. We have historical records of this. Mahidevran, a consort of Suleiman the Magnificent, mutilated the face of her rival Roxolana with her fingernails.
You're kidding.
No. Tore gashes so deep they left permanent scars. Another consort, Gulu, pushed a rival off a cliff.
Off a cliff.
Literally. The atmosphere is paranoid. The phrase used in the sources is chilling. Every glass of sherbet potentially poisoned. You couldn't trust anyone. So when we talk about the Night of the Sacks, we have to remember, these women, Isa, Layla, Fatma, they were already living in a war zone. They were survivors just by being there.
And the soldiers in that war zone, the ones keeping order, were the eunuchs. Let's talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our story, they are the ones holding the needles. Who were these men?
The eunuchs of the Ottoman harem were the guardians of the gates, and their story is just as traumatic as the women's. They were primarily taken from East Africa, Abyssinia, Nubia, boys around 7 or 8 years old.
Also taken by slave raiders.
Yes, and then transported to Cairo. And in Cairo, they underwent the procedure. And we have to be clear about what this entailed. This wasn't just sterilization, what they did to some prisoners of war. This was total removal.
And the survival rate for a surgery like that in the 17th century, in the heat of Egypt?
Was catastrophic. Historians estimate only 10 to 20% of the boys survived the surgery. It was done by Coptic monks who were specialists in this brutal practice.
Only 10 to 20%.
But that high mortality rate is precisely what made the survivors so expensive and so valuable.
It's horrifying economics, supply and demand based on survival rates.
It is. But once they arrived in Constantinople, they had a unique status. Because they had no biological ties to the dynasty, they couldn't have children, they couldn't start their own rival families, they were considered the only ones the Sultan could truly trust.
Okay.
They were loyal only to the throne.
And they had a hierarchy, just like the women.
A very rigid one. At the very top was the Kisler Aga, the chief black eunuch. I cannot overstate how powerful this man was. He was the third most powerful official in the entire empire. After the Sultan and the Grand Vizier, he was a general in the army, a minister of state. He controlled all the royal mosques and their finances.
So he's not just a guard.
Not even close. He was the only intermediary between the government and the Sultan. If the Grand Vizier, the prime minister, essentially wanted to speak to the Sultan, he had to go through the Kisler Aga.
And inside the harem.
He was the absolute authority. He controlled access. He decided who the Sultan saw. He was the watcher. He was the punisher. And, as we see in the story of the sacks, he was the executioner.
So we have the women, trapped in a lethal competition for their children's lives. We have the eunuchs, the enforcers who have been stripped of their humanity to serve the state. Now, we need to introduce the third element of this tragedy, the man at the center of it all, the Sultan.
Ibrahim.
Ibrahim the Mad.
But before he was the Mad Sultan, he was just a kid in a very dangerous position.
He was a younger brother, and in the Ottoman dynasty, being a younger brother was usually a death sentence.
Because of the fratricide law.
Yes. For centuries, the custom was that when a new sultan took the throne, he would execute all his brothers. It was done to prevent civil war.
A brutal kind of logic.
The philosophy was Nizam Ilam, order of the world. Better to have one dead prince than the civil war that kills thousands. They were strangled with a silk bowstring because it was forbidden to spill royal blood on the ground.
There's that famous, terrible example of Mehmed III. Mehmed III, in 1595, he executed 19 brothers in a single day. Some of them were infants. The sources say they were carried to the executioner by their own nurses, playing with toys.
That is unspeakable.
It was. And the empire knew it. It was becoming a stain on their legitimacy. It's too gruesome even for them. So in 1603, Sultan Ahmed, Ibrahim's father, decided to change the rules.
Okay.
He stopped the bloodbath. He introduced a new system called the cafes.
A cage.
The cage. Instead of killing the princes, they would be locked away.
Now, when we say cage, I think listeners are picturing a dungeon. Bars on the windows,
Okay.
water dripping from the ceiling. Is that accurate?
Not exactly. It was a gilded cage. It was a luxurious suite of rooms inside the harem. High ceilings, stained glass, Persian carpets, the finest food, but there was no exit.
Right.
The doors were bricked up, leaving only a small service hatch. They were guarded 204/7. The windows were high up, so you could see the sky, but not the ground. You couldn't see the people outside.
And who was inside?
The princes. From the age of 7 or 8, they were locked in. They stayed there until they either died or were called to be sultan. Some spent decades inside.
And were they alone?
They had tutors and servants, and they were given concubines. But, and this is a crucial detail for our story, the concubines given to the men in the cage were sterilized.
Sterilized.
Yes, surgical sterilization or women confirmed to be barren because a prince in the cage could not be allowed to have children. A son would be a potential heir, a threat to the reigning sultan.
So if a woman in the cage did get pregnant by some fluke,
The eunuchs would drown her immediately, no questions asked. The system had no tolerance for that kind of risk.
so this is the environment Ibrahim grows up in.
Ibrahim enters the cage at age 8. His older brother, Murad IV, becomes sultan. Now, Murad was violent, unstable.
This is the brother who banned coffee.
He banned coffee and alcohol, despite being a raging alcoholic himself. He would walk the streets in disguise and execute people on the spot with a massive sword he carried. He executed musicians for playing Persian songs, which he disliked. He forced women to jump into pools so he could shoot at them with an arquebus for sport. He was terrifying.
And Ibrahim is locked in a room while this maniac is running the empire.
And Murad is slowly killing off his other brothers, one by one. Ibrahim is the youngest. He's the last one left.
Imagine the psychological torture.
He spent 17 years in that room. 17 years. Every time he heard footsteps in the hall, he didn't know if it was dinner or the executioner. He lived in a state of constant high adrenaline terror.
The source mentions he started hallucinating.
Yes, he talked to the walls. He fed gold coins to the fish in the pool because he didn't know what else to do with them. He was completely detached from reality. By the time his brother Murad finally died in 1640, Ibrahim was broken.
And there's that incredible moment when they come to tell him he's sultan.
It's unbelievable. He refused to open the door. The Grand Vizier is knocking, saying, "Your brother is dead. You are the Sultan. Come out." And Ibrahim is barricaded inside, shouting, "It's a trick. You're here to kill me."
He didn't believe it. After 17 years of paranoia, he couldn't.
He was so convinced it was a trap that his own mother, Kosum Sultan, had to come and plead with him. Even then, he refused. So they literally had to shove his brother's corpse through the doorway so he could touch it.
No.
Yes. Only when he felt the cold skin of his dead brother did he agree to come out.
So we have a man with severe PTSD who has been isolated for 17 years, who has no social skills, no understanding of the world, and suddenly he is the absolute ruler of 3 continents.
A broken man with absolute power. It was a recipe for disaster.
And disaster is exactly what happened. Let's talk about his reign. He comes out of the cage, and he goes a little wild.
Wild is putting it mildly. His mother, Kosum, she tried to manage him. Her strategy was basically, okay, you stay in the harem and have fun. I'll run the state.
Keep him distracted.
Right. But his appetites were insatiable. He was obsessed with sensory stimulation. Remember, he'd been in a quiet room for decades. Now he wanted everything. He lined his walls with mirrors so he could see himself everywhere. He used amber perfume obsessively, so much that people said it made them dizzy to be in the room with him.
And The furs. The Sable King.
That was a specific obsession. One of his concubines told him a story about a mythical king who dressed in sable fur. It triggered something in him. He demanded sable from everywhere. He lined the walls with fur. He dressed his cats in fur.
He dressed his cats in sable.
He did, but I want to pause here because it sounds funny, right? Like a cartoon villain. Oh, look at the cats in fur coats. But the sources point out this actually had a devastating economic impact. We're not just talking about a weird hobby.
Right, because sable isn't cheap. It's one of the most expensive furs in the world.
It's incredibly expensive. And to feed this obsession, Ibrahim instituted the sable tax. He forced high-ranking officials, governors, even the religious elite to procure these incredibly rare furs from Russia.
So they had to pay their taxes in fur.
Yes. We're talking about wealth transfer on a massive scale. It was bankrupting them.
So he's bleeding the political class dry to decorate his bedroom wall.
Exactly. And this is crucial for understanding the coup later. It
Right.
wasn't just that he was drowning women. Sadly, the empire could tolerate cruelty. What they couldn't tolerate was him touching their money. When the bread prices quadrupled because of the Venetian blockade and the Sultan is still demanding furs, that's when the Janissaries decide, okay, he has to go.
But before the coup, there was the harem. He was reputed to take 24 concubines a day.
He was trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled, and he had very specific tastes. He became obsessed with size. He sent agents out into the empire with instructions to find the heaviest woman they could.
And they found her.
They found Sivikar. She was an Armenian woman. The sources say she weighed over 330 pounds. Ibrahim absolutely adored her. He nicknamed her Sugar Cube.
Sugar Cube. And she wasn't just a passive figure, right? She starts to climb the ladder.
She rocketed up the ladder. Ibrahim was so infatuated that he did something unprecedented. He named her the Governor General of Damascus.
Wait, he made a concubine a governor?
A former slave became a high-ranking government official. It was a massive breach of protocol. He gave her wealth and jewels that he confiscated from his own sisters. He humiliated the royal princesses to elevate Sugar Cube.
That must have made her some enemies.
It made her a target. But Sivikar was smart. She knew Ibrahim was paranoid, so she fed that paranoia. She whispered in his ear. She told him which women were plotting against him. She used his trauma as a weapon to destroy her rivals.
She was playing the game.
She was winning the game. Until she went too far. She started wielding real political power, interfering with the state. And that is when Kosem Sultan stepped in.
Kosem, Ibrahim's mother, the real power behind the throne.
Kosem was not a woman to be trifled with. She realized Sivikar was destabilizing the Sultan, and by extension, the state. So she invited Sugar Cube to dinner.
That sounds ominous.
It was. During the meal, on Kosem's orders, the eunuch strangled Sivikar.
Just like that.
Just like that. Kosem told Ibrahim that she had died of a sudden illness.
And how did Ibrahim take it?
He was devastated, but more importantly, he was unmoored. Sivikar had been his anchor, even if she was a toxic one. With her gone and with her whispers still echoing in his head, his paranoia exploded.
And this brings us to the edge of the cliff, the trigger for the night of the sacks.
Yes. Before she died, Sivikar had planted a lie in Ibrahim's mind. She told him that one of the concubines had been compromised, that she had been intimate with an outsider.
An outsider in the harem. That seems impossible given the security we just talked about.
It was virtually impossible. The eunuchs guarded every door. But to a man who spent 17 years expecting to be murdered, impossible doesn't matter. The betrayal was real in his mind.
Right.
He believed it. He demanded to know who it was. But of course, no one could tell him because there was no crime.
So he investigates.
He tortures the harem. He interrogates women. The eunuchs are tearing the place apart looking for a culprit who doesn't exist. Ibrahim's rage is building and building. He feels betrayed by everyone. And finally, he decides to clean the slate.
He decides to get rid of all of them.
He orders the execution of 280 women.
280. It's hard to even visualize that number of people.
It's the entire population of a small village. And this is where the logistics come in. The Ottoman machine we talked about. This is where it goes into high gear.
Right.
Ibrahim gives the order. And the eunuchs don't hesitate. They don't argue. They go to the storerooms. They get the canvas sacks. They get the needles. They get the stones.
Let's walk through the process, the night of the sacks.
It happens at night to maintain secrecy, but also because the Bosphorus currents are specific. The women are brought to the courtyard, as we described with Isa.
And they are put into the sacks alive.
Alive. They are forced into the canvas. The stones are added to the bottom of the sack to ensure negative buoyancy. And then the Kislar Aga and his men sew the top shut. Imagine that moment. You are in a sack. It's dark. You can feel the cold stones against your legs. You can hear the needle piercing the canvas above your head. You can hear the breathing of the other women around you being packed into their own sacks.
And then they are moved.
The eunuchs carry them. Remember, a person plus stones is heavy. This required a lot of manpower. They carry them to the terrace, and they throw them over the wall.
Into the Bosphorus.
The Bosphorus is a street that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. The water is dark, cold, and the currents are very fast.
The source goes into the science of this. It's not instant, is it?
No. Drowning is not a peaceful drifting away. It takes 2 to 4 minutes, and for most of that time, you are conscious.
Oh, man.
You are in a sack, sinking into freezing water. The panic is absolute. The body fights for air. Eventually, there is a reflex where you inhale fluid. It is a terrifying, violent way to die.
And this happened 280 times that night.
Sack after sack, splash after splash, for hours.
Is there physical evidence of this? Or is it just a legend? Because sometimes history exaggerates.
It's more than legend. We have accounts from European diplomats who were in the city. We have Ottoman chronicles. But the most haunting evidence came later.
Yeah.
Decades later, French divers were working in the Bosphorus, exploring the seabed near the palace.
What did they find?
They found what they described as a forest of sacks.
A forest?
The canvas had rotted, but the stones were still there, holding the remains on the bottom, hundreds of them. And at the time, right after the event, fishermen reported pulling up bodies in their nets for days. The scale was impossible to hide.
But someone did survive.
One woman, Turhan Hatis.
Why her?
She was the mother of the heir. She had borne Ibrahim a son, Mehmed. Killing her would have endangered the line of succession, so she was spared.
But she had to walk.
She had to stand in that courtyard. She watched her friends, her rivals, her entire world being sewn up and thrown into the sea. She listened to it happen.
That trauma.
Yeah.
That has to change a person.
It turned her into steel. Turhan Hatis would go on to become one of the most ruthless and powerful Valida sultans in history. She learned that night that in the harem, you are either the one holding the rope or you are the one in the sack.
This atrocity. It didn't save Ibrahim, did it?
No. In fact, it accelerated his fall. The empire was in ruin. The Venetian blockade was causing famine in the city. Bread prices had quadrupled. People were starving in the streets while Ibrahim was buying furs and drowning women.
The disconnect was too big.
The machine finally turned on its master. In 1648, a year after the drownings, the Janissaries, the elite soldiers, revolted. The religious scholars, the ulema, backed them.
And Kosem.
And Kosem Sultan, his own mother, gave the nod.
She turned on him, her own son.
She had to. She was a pragmatist. She saw that Ibrahim was going to destroy the dynasty. She's recorded as saying, "In the end, he will leave neither you nor me alive. The whole society is in ruins."
She agreed to the coup.
So they come for him. The mob tears the Grand Vizier to pieces, literally 1,000 pieces. That's the historical nickname he got. And then they drag Ibrahim back to the cafes.
Back to the cage.
The full circle. He is dragged back to the same room he was locked in as a child, and the executioners come in.
And this is tragic in its own way,
Yeah.
even after everything he did.
It's pathetic. He realizes what is happening, and he recognized one of the executioners. It's a man he had fed, a man he had employed. And Ibrahim begs him. He says, "Is there no one among those who have eaten my bread who will take pity on me?"
Is there no one who will take pity on me? That is a haunting line.
But the answer was no. They strangled him with the silk cord.
And the cycle continues.
It does. His son, the 6-year-old Mad, is put on the throne. Turhan Hatis, the survivor of the sacks, steps up to protect him. And a few years later, Turhan and Kosem have their final showdown.
The survivor versus the matriarch.
And the survivor won. In 1651, Kosem Sultan, the woman who had run the empire for decades, was hunted down in the harem's storage rooms.
Storage rooms. Like where the sacks were kept.
Exactly. She was strangled with her own braids by the eunuchs. The new regime, led by Turhan, took her out.
It's so brutal. It's just constant violence.
But notice something. When Kosem died, the city mourned. Mosques were closed. People cried in the streets. She was seen as a great stateswoman, a grandmother to the empire. But for the 280 women in the sacks, silence.
Because they were property.
They were anonymous. They were counted, not named. History remembers the sultan who ordered it. It remembers the queen mother who allowed it. But the victims, they're just a number.
The system didn't stop with Ibrahim, did it?
No, that's the most depressing part. The harem continued for another 250 years. The machine kept grinding. It wasn't until 1909, when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, that the doors were finally opened.
1909. That's the 20th century. That's cars and telephones.
And yet, inside Topkapi, time had stood still. When they opened the gates, 370 women and 127 eunuchs were released. Some of the women were old. They had been there for 50 years. They walked out into the streets of Constantinople and saw the outside world for the first time. They had no skills, no family, nowhere to go.
There's a story about the last eunuch, right?
Yes, Saadi Aga. Journalists found him in a coffee shop in the 1950s. Imagine that. A relic of this medieval system sitting in a modern coffee shop. They asked him about the harem. They asked him about the past.
What does he say?
He refused to speak of it. He said, "We are uneducated people. What would we know? Let us focus on the present." He took the secrets to his grave.
Wow. You know, when you visit Topkapi Palace today,
Mm-hmm.
it's a museum. It's beautiful. You see the tiles, the gold.
It's stunning. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth.
But if you stand on that terrace,
If you stand on the terrace, you are standing where the eunuchs stood. You look at the view that the tourists take photos of, the glittering Bosphorus. And you have to realize that underneath that water, beneath the beauty, lies the evidence of the cost.
it really makes you question how we view history. We romanticize the Orient, the harem, the mystery.
We do. We turn it into a fairy tale. But the architecture of beauty was built on an architecture of horror. Was Ibrahim a monster? Yes. But he was a monster created by a cage. He was a victim who created countless more victims.
And the 280 women.
They were the fuel that the machine burned to keep running.
It's a heavy thought to end on, but an important one. Next time you see a picture of those beautiful tiled walls, remember what happened behind them.
And remember Ursa and Layla and Fatma? The names we do know, they represent the hundreds we don't.
Exactly. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.